Hey folks, my name is Vedant Sachdeva, and today I'm going to be talking to you about evolving optimal constrained sensory encoding schemes using state-space models. This is work done in collaboration with Thierry Mora, Arvid Murugan, Stephanie Palmer, and Alexandra Walchuk at some superposition of the University of Chicago and Nicole Normal Superior. So I'll start off by positing to you that kind of a core problem for biological systems is estimating the state of their environment. That can be relevant for a number of reasons, and to kind of walk through a few examples, we can start by looking at the cyanobacteria. Here you might be wanting to decide which metabolic reactions to run, and the metabolic reactions you're going to run is going to be dependent on the availability of light in your environment. So a core problem for you is estimating the phase of the day based on the amount of light you have access to at any given time. You could also, for example, be a tiger salamander and be desperately afraid of getting eaten. So what you might be interested in doing is using information that you're getting from your eyes based on the visual scene to estimate the state of predators so you can decide whether or not you have to run away. Lastly, you could be Marques Brownlee, aka MKBHD, and be very interested in estimating the state of a frisbee as it flies through the air because you're interested in making that big grab at the end of the game. In all of these examples, people have thought a lot about how you should think about the sensory encoding scheme being constructed. And there's kind of a key paradigm that people have come to, and I've outlined a particular example here from a Chalk 2018 paper. And in this particular in this particular encoding scheme, we think of things as maximizing a particular objective function. And the way that objective function is maximized is by maximizing the mutual information between your sensory response or a collection thereof and some particular statistic that you're interested in. In this case, the statistic that one is interested in is the future of the scene or the future of the system, while minimizing the mutual information between your sensory response and all available information in your dynamical system. This is sort of an interesting paradigm and permits a lot of really exciting thinking about predictive coding and predictive information and things of that nature. But one thing I kind of want to point out is that this sensory encoding scheme doesn't really allow for the idea of recursion, which is to say, like this is a process. We are making sensory responses all the time. We're making state estimates all the time. And we should be able to leverage the fact that we have past state estimates to make our next one. So kind of with that in mind, I'm going to propose a novel paradigm. And that novel paradigm is adding memory to the process. So here's the setup of the problem that I'm going to pitch to you. And the setup is as follows. Imagine there is a dynamical system parameterized by coordinates x. And at each time step, I get to make a sensory response. This could be the phosphorylation state of Ka or something like that, or it could be my retinal ganglion cells firing pattern in response to a particular visual cue, whatever. It's something, right? But I get to make it in response to the external environment. Now, using my sensory response, I get to make an estimate x hat, and hopefully x hat is very close to what x is. Now, if I wait some time delta t, the dynamical system drives the environment to a new state, and I get to make a new sensory response because my sensory response is responding to the current state of the environment or the most recent available state of the environment. Now, to make my estimate x hat, I actually can do two things. I can actually combine information from two sources. One is, of course, again, from my sensory response, Z, but the other is by forecasting forward my previous state to make a new state estimate. So this basically leverages two things. One is what is my measurement based on Z, and what is my forecast based on the past x hat. And I can actually do this iteratively. I can continue to do this again and again and again. And altogether, if I build up the entire scheme, it looks something like this. Now, so what I'm saying here is that the new paradigm that I proposed is that we get to exploit memory in our sensory encoding. Some of you in the audience may be very intrigued by this, but also may be thinking, oh, isn't this exactly a Kalman filter? And you'd be right. In fact, it is a Kalman filter, but with sort of one key difference. And that is, oftentimes when we think about these sensory encoding schemes in biology, we think of them as being evolvable, or they can mutate and change over time. In the language of Kalman filters, this is like saying the observation model can change. And as far as I can tell, people don't really consider evolving or optimized observation models for particular powers. And that's sort of the kind of the key insight that I'm taking here. So when I put everything together, I'm saying I have actually brought in two pieces. One is from the Kalman filter, the idea of the usage of a previous state and a current measurement to make an estimate. And from neuroscience, I'm using the idea of optimizing over the space of sensory encoding schemes. And by putting them together, we get something new. And to kind of share with you the results of this new piece of math, I'm going to take a quick example, and that example is going to be a one-dimensional process with some noise and some correlation structure. Doesn't matter the exact details of it because I'll walk through kind of the whole space, the whole family of models. But we'll start off by looking at one particular example and one particular optimization. So here I've chosen some value of the trade-off parameter beta, which tells us how powerful our sensory encoding scheme can be, and some particular value of the correlation, which basically tells us how correlated are xt and xt plus delta t. Now, for comparison's sake, I want to describe what I call an uninformed prior, which is this leftmost bar. This uninformed prior is basically what you would estimate the state of the system to be if all you had was an unordered list of where that system has been in time, right? You would just guess, well, it's probably within one standard deviation of the mean, so that's my certainty. Now, here you're allowed to make a sensory response, of course, and by making a sensory response, you can get an improvement in your uncertainty of the system because your sensory response is giving you some sort of measurement of the scheme. But here you'll notice the measurement is actually very weak. It's only reducing the uncertainty by 10%. But what I want to show you is that by putting together the uncertainty based on your previous estimate and your sensory response right now, you can actually obtain close to a 40% reduction in uncertainty, even though you only had a 7% reduction in uncertainty through your sensory response. Now, you might be thinking, well, most of that is coming from the fact that your forecast uncertainty, which is based on forecasting the previous state estimate forward, is actually like a 35% improvement or something like that. And you'd be right, except you have to keep in mind that the forecast uncertainty is also based on the sensory response, but the collection of sensory responses from the past, right? So it's not as though I can arbitrarily tune the uncertainty of the forecast uncertainty without changing the sensory response in exchange. I can't reduce the forecast uncertainty any more than it already is because the sensory response is limiting it. So what this is to say is that any given time, even though my sensory response reduces the uncertainty by 7%, I can overall reduce my uncertainty in the estimate of the state by 40%. Now, one thing you might be wondering is, well, what happens if you tune to a different value of the trade-off parameter beta, or you change the correlation structure in your environment? And for those of you who are wondering that kind of question, I've posited the following phase diagram. And in this phase diagram, there's sort of three interesting phases that emerge. The first is this dark blue phase. And in this dark blue phase, and creating a sensory response or creating a sensory map is so expensive that you'd rather just not do it at all. You'd rather stick to just guessing based on means and standard deviations. Not super interesting, at least to me. There's also another limit where your sensory response is so inexpensive that you can make one that is very high precision. In fact, in this particular regime right here, this bottom yellow regime, the sensory response is so good that the uncertainty from just your sensory response is actually smaller than that of the one based on your forecast, because your forecast estimate has some dynamical noise in it based on your model of the dynamical system, whereas your sensory response is just measurement noise. Your measurement noise is lower than the dynamical process noise. So you get sort of a place where you memorize the state, and that's all you do. Finally, in between the two phases is a phase where you have to leverage both, and this is sort of the really exciting phase here. Now, I've done more than what I've shown just now. I've also extended this to two-dimensional systems for completeness' sake, and I'd be happy to talk about it in an offline manner. But for now, I want to leave you with kind of three key conclusions. One is that I've shown you how sensory organs should be optimized and constructed if you're allowed to use memory. And two is that I've created a formalism that can be applied to non-Gaussian statistics. If you're super interested, please feel free to send me an email. I've listed it here. And of course, I'd like to acknowledge the people in my lab, my funding sources, and Alex and Thierry. Thank you.